Hello guys, welcome to our YouTube channel Edu Hub. So as you know, we will continue from previous video. So today, as you know, we will go for part 3. So without wasting any time, let's get started, and please like our video and share to your friends. Introduction to Web Design and Development Part 3.
We have our HTML structure in place, but wow, we can make this look more appealing. That's where CSS comes in. CSS will make everything pretty for us. Let's start by making that button look pretty first. We'll need to enlarge the text, make the button yellow, and set it so that when we roll our mouse over the button, it turns green. Then we'll need to move on to the other text. We'll need to set up our big blue box, style the text with the Arial font, and give everything a little bit of room. By the time we're done here, this will look like the button has been clicked and the box is showing. Let's start writing some CSS. So we'll start by styling our button by going to our CSS panel and typing in the word button. This is going to style all of the buttons in our document the same way. In this case, we only have one button, so that's totally fine with us. But if we added other buttons to this document, they would take on the same styling. After the word button, you're going to put in some curly braces. And those are the ones, if you hit the Shift key and look next to the letter P, those are those curly braces that you see there. Usually, you have one brace on the first line with the CSS selector, as it's referred to, the word button in this case, and another curly brace down underneath. And that is just for readability purposes, that we know we're about to write a description of what we want the button to look like using CSS as our language. And we'll start by saying our button background color is pound or hashtag F2C33C semicolon. What is this that I just wrote here? Well, the word background-color is called a property. There are hundreds of properties in CSS. This is a pretty common one, and it's pretty straightforward. It's going to change the background color of, in this case, our button. The 6-digit item after that with that hashtag or pound sign is a color. It's written in hexadecimal format, and it describes, in this case, a shade of yellow on the screen here. We'd probably like to make our text bigger, so we can change our font -size to something like, let's say, 20 pixels. And that will enlarge our text size. There's a lot of different units for sizing in CSS. Pixels is one of the easiest and best understood. We can set our text color. Right now it is set to black by default, and perhaps we like that, we want to keep that. You can, of course, simply type in that information again and you won't hurt anything. So here's the word color followed by 000000. That's how you write black in hexadecimal code. So nothing changes here. It was already set for us by our web browser, but now we've very explicitly described it as well here in our CSS. We can set some padding of 10 pixels. This is going to add a little bit of space between the words and the edges of our button. That's what padding does. We can also round the corners by saying a border-radius of 10 pixels. That'll round the corners of the button, make it a little bit more attractive looking. And finally, we can change the border around this button. So we can say border is going to be 3 pixels, solid, and 808080 for our color, which will give us a shade of gray. So this is the way our button looks right now. I can roll my mouse over it and nothing changes, which is kind of weird. You expect a button to change when you roll your mouse over it. So let's add that as a style as well. And our next style then, I'm going to say our button, but in this case, we're going to put in a colon followed by the word hover. Don't put any spaces in there. So button, hover, all one word. And this is going to be in the hover state. In other words, when I roll my mouse over this button, what is going to change? So here we're going to change our background color to 7cc272. So there we go. That changes it to green when I roll my mouse over it. And if you want, you can change the color of the text. I've lightened this up a little bit, 333333. So we've gone from a black to a charcoal gray color for our text. And then finally, remember that we have a class here of hidden on our section, and I'm going to write some styling for that. So rather than writing styling for section, for example, and in a web page we may have many sections of the web page, but this section is particularly special. I want it to be styled in a unique kind of way. And so in this case, instead of saying section, I'm going to say dot hidden. The dot indicates that this is a class, which is what we have here in our HTML. And so anytime we have a class of hidden, we're going to apply the following styles. Font-family is Arial sans serif. That is always the change that makes me happy because we have changed our text from Times to Arial. And in case people don't have Arial installed on their computer for some reason, we want them to use the generic sans serif font. That means a font that doesn't have the little lines hanging off the edges of it, or serifs. Let's give this a background color of 509 FCB. That'll make it blue. Once again, we can give this a color. 000000 is black. Right now, this is stretching all the way across the page. Maybe I'd like this to be a little bit more compact, so I can give it a width of, let's say, 400 pixels. So that'll make it a little bit narrower. Let's get the text off the edges of the box here. Right now, the text is running right into the edges of the blue. Let's give it a little breathing room by adding padding of 20 pixels. And now by adding that padding, now we're running into the bottom of that button. So what I'd like to do is to put some space in between the button and that blue box. And we can do that with something called margin, but I want that only on the top. So margin hyphen top, 20 pixels. That'll push that blue box down just a little bit. And now finally, because I rounded the corners of my button, I should probably also round the corners of my box just to make things look consistent. Border hyphen radius of 10 pixels. And that will round all my corners in the same way. So at this point, what we have is our button. It changes color on hover, but on click, it doesn't do anything. Clicking is in the realm of JavaScript. And we have our box, the blue that we want it to look like when we see it. But remember, we want it to start without this box visible. So these are things that we're going to need to change with JavaScript. We have another step to make our design function correctly. The page should start showing only the button. Then when we click the button, the blue box will be revealed. Finally, when we click the button again, the blue box should be hidden. CSS has a hover state, but it doesn't have a click state. Anytime we start thinking about clicking, we must think about JavaScript. Before we jump into writing this JavaScript, let's finish up with the last tweaks we need to make to our CSS. Our JavaScript will ultimately toggle between two CSS states. We're going to have a class of hidden and a class of showing, and the CSS will turn those respectively on and off in order for this blue box to appear or disappear on the web page. But our CSS doesn't do that right now. The only thing we have at the moment is a class of hidden, and it's showing, which makes no sense whatsoever. So let's fix this particular problem. I am going to switch this class of hidden to a class of showing. You can call CSS classes whatever you like, and they will very happily sit here inside of your CSS, even if they are not used in your HTML. So here I have a class of showing that doesn't exist in my HTML. If you check the HTML, it's not there, but it will sit right there in the CSS and be very, very happy. Likewise, we're calling for a class of hidden, and for that matter, a class of click me here inside of our HTML, but we have no corresponding CSS to deal with that. and that's okay too. We're going to make that happen here in just a moment. So what's happened to our text over here on this side is that it is displaying in the default unstyled format. We're closer to what we want to have this page look like when we start, but we're not quite there. So I'm going to add back my class of hidden, and I'm going to simply say display none. That will in fact hide away all of that text. It still exists because it's here inside of our HTML. It's just not displaying here on our web page. And then for our class of showing, we'll switch this to a display of block. And that will make our blue block appear on the page. So that's really the magic sauce there. We're just going to switch between those two classes. And now we'll write some JavaScript that will make that particular magic happen. So let's pull up our JavaScript block here. And because JavaScript is a bit more involved and a bit easier to make mistakes with, I've given this to you in your exercise files. And I'm just going to copy right from that file into this document. So I'm going to start by highlighting that code there you see for step 1. Just highlight that, copy, and paste here on the page. And then we can talk about what that means. So this line of JavaScript tells you to look for a class of ClickMe here inside of your HTML. That's the document. We're looking for the query selector of ClickMe. When you find one of those, or potentially several of those, you want to add what's called an event listener. Add an event listener called click. So in other words, when that click happens, we want something to happen in our JavaScript. That's the two parts of the JavaScript. When something happens, do this thing. Well, this is the when something happens part of that. We're currently not doing anything. We're just listening. Yes, there was a click. That's just all it says right now. Now let's go add our second line of code. If we switch back over to our exercise files, I'm going to copy that second line of code here, and I'm going to drop it into my code pen. We'll just erase what was there and drop this in. So you'll see there's that first line that says, find the click me and just listen when it's clicked. Then we want to do this. So what does the second line of code say then? This says, when the button is clicked, now we're going to look for a class of hidden. Then for each time that we find that class of hidden, because there may be several of them, there isn't an R page, but there could be, we're going to do something else. But we haven't specified what that is yet either. Notice how already our curly brackets and our parentheses and our semicolons are starting to pile up here in our code. This is something that you wind up learning how to manage as a developer. But these are nested inside of each other, similar to that structure that we saw with the HTML, where we had several different HTML tags nested inside of each other here in our section. We have that same thing going on here inside of our JavaScript. In this case, though, we are just doing it with different types of punctuation, so-called syntax. Let's add that third line of code now. So in step 3 here from your exercise files folder, if we just copy that little bit of code and replace what we have here with that, now we've added the last step to this process. And so for each item in the list, we're going to toggle the class to showing. So now in full, we have all of our JavaScript here. Let's just go through exactly what's going to happen. So first, we're going to find a class of ClickMe in the document. And to that element, we're going to listen for when that element is clicked. Then when the ClickMe gets clicked, now find an element with a class of hidden. And for every element with a class of hidden, we're going to swap it to a class of showing. So when those classes are toggled, we're going to go from our hidden class, where the text is completely hidden, just like it is as we see here, to showing, which is going to display our blue section. So now is the moment of truth. Let's see what happens when we click our button. Sure enough, it should in fact appear here on the page. And when you click again, it goes away. Because this is a toggle, JavaScript knows that if the button is clicked again, it should do the opposite thing. In this case, swapping the class from showing to hidden, which will hide the box away, thanks to our CSS styling. Over the next few videos, we're going to build a little piece of a web page. It will look like this. There's a yellow button on this page. When you roll your mouse over it, it changes to green. When you click it, a text box will appear. When you click the button again, the blue box disappears. Anytime you start writing code for the web, that always starts with HTML. Let's look at our demo page and decide what we need. First, we need a button. Because this button is clickable through JavaScript, we'll use the button element to set this up. Second, we'll need some kind of box to contain our text. Then inside of that box, we'll have a heading and some paragraphs of text. By identifying the function of the content before we start coding, we also identify its structure. With that in mind, let's start coding.
To get started here in CodePen, we're going to go to the left column and look for pen. And you'll see here that we have the option of writing a couple of kinds of pens. We want just the generic one. And your screen may look a little bit different than mine as you get started. That's because I have different things in my copy of CodePen than you have in yours. Don't worry too much about the rest of the screen. You just want to click on this button right here that says pen to make a new pen. And in here, let's start by typing in the text that we are going to include in this web page. We're going to have a button eventually. It's going to say, click me. Then I'm going to have some more text. It's going to say, look what I'm learning. After that, it will say, when clicked, a button will reveal this text. Since this is getting a little long, and we're just going to work on HTML here, I'm going to make my HTML window a little bit bigger so I can just keep typing here. And then I'm going to say click again, and the text will hide away. So as I told you in a previous video, even though we've typed it in all on different lines, it displays all on the same line here because we haven't told our web browser what this text is. And the web browser doesn't respect these returns on the line, so it just sticks it all on the same line. So in order to be a little bit more specific about what we're doing, we're going to need to add some HTML. This click me up here at the top, well, that is the thing we're going to click. It's going to be a button, so we're going to use the button element here, which starts with an angle bracket and the word button, and then closes the same way that you saw before. So it'll say button and then slash button on the other side. All HTML elements are formed in this kind of way, and there are about 112 of these HTML elements. So we don't have time to cover all of them here. I'll just tell you about a few. Now, this area here is going to be a bunch of text, and we kind of need to group it together. We want to think about this as a whole unit. As you saw, this whole unit of text will show up and then it will go away again, but we're also saying individual things with each line. So let's start by grouping together our text, and I'm going to use an element called section to do that. So this is a section of our web page, /section. Now to keep things readable, what you may want to do is highlight your text here and then click the Tab key on your keyboard. That'll indent it slightly. Now it's really clear that this text is located inside of the section. And this kind of indentation is something you'll see all over coding and all over HTML for sure. So up here now, look at what I'm learning. That's the most important thing that's here on this page. And so we're going to assign that an element of H1, as in heading 1. There are 6 headings, H1 through H6, H1 being the most important and H6 being the least important. It happens to be that H1 displays bold and with larger text, but that's something we can change with CSS, so don't let that bother you. If it's the right element, that is the one you should be using on the page. As for these last two here, well, those are probably paragraphs again, right? We've talked about paragraphs before, so we can simply mark these up as paragraphs. And that will cause these to each display on their own line, which is part of the styling that's associated with your web browser. So it looks pretty ugly so far. Don't worry about it. That is exactly what HTML is supposed to do. We have one small addition that we need to make before we move on here, and that is the following. To the button here, we're going to add something called an attribute. These are sort of descriptors. If you think of tags as nouns, attributes would be adjectives. They're additional information about that particular element. So here with the button, we're going to add a class of click me, and we're going to put that in as class equals, and then the word click me in quotes next to it. This is kind of like giving this a name. And it's not a super specific name. This is like saying we're talking about a street in your neighborhood. There may be many houses on that street, but this is kind of like buttons that have this class of click me. We're going to treat them a little bit differently than buttons in general. So that's what that is there for. And then here on our section, we're going to add a class of hidden. And that's because, of course, we're going to treat this section potentially differently than other sections. And we're sort of hinting at what we're going to do here. We're going to start with it hidden away. So if you've got all of that, you are in excellent shape. Click the Save button here inside of CodePen. It'll save your work. You can give it a title here, My First CodePen. And you can continue to add to this as you move through the other videos in this chapter. How did your code turn out? There's an infinite number of solutions to this problem. My solution is only one possible solution. If your button still works the way it did before we started making modifications, then you have a great solution to this challenge. I made a bunch of changes to my HTML and CSS. Here's the changes that I made. I worked with the American palette here at flatuicolors.com, which I mentioned before. Here's the American palette. You could have picked any of these. And when you click that, it'll show you all of the colors that are here in that palette. And as you roll your mouse around, you see the copy buttons come up. I like this one here. And so I clicked on that copy button and it copied that particular color, which I can then paste that color hexadecimal code here into the CSS where I'd like it to go. So then the changes that I made here, starting with our HTML, you'll notice that I now have two sections that appear on click, just like that. So I have a first section, which is very similar to what I had before, and I added the second section. It has one less paragraph, but otherwise it works exactly the same way. Then when we go into our CSS here, I made a bunch of changes here. So first of all, in my button, I changed my font family to Georgia. I changed my background color here of that button to green and upped my font size to 30. Changed my text color to white and my border color to yellow. So you see all those changes there. And when I hover over that button, now it turns yellow and we have black text that appears instead. Notice too, I got rid of the border radius that I had before. We've got all pointy corners going on in my solution here. And then in my showing state, I have changed my font family here to Georgia as well and changed my background color to that purple that I copied over from the American palette and got rid of the rounded corners here as well to make it all consistent between the button and my blocks of text here. I hope that making a couple of your own tweaks here has helped you understand HTML and CSS a little bit better than you understood it as you started to watch these videos. I hope you find it empowering that you can just jump into this code and start making changes and experiment with things. And you should be really proud of whatever it is that you built. I have a challenge for you. This will give a bit of practice working with HTML and CSS. Ready? For this challenge, open and fork this code pen, or if you're continuing from the previous video, continue to use your own code, and make at least 3 changes to enhance this web page. If you are forking this code pen, go down to the bottom of the screen here, look for this button here that says fork, click it. That will make a copy of my challenge here, this document, and copy it into your own code pen space so you can make your own changes to this. If you want to work with HTML, make a second section with a class of hidden. Give it some different content. When you click the button, both sections should appear. As you build this second section, you may want to click your button once to have the sections open so you can see them while you style them. I recommend looking at the CSS in particular. You may want to do things like changing colors. If you have color choices, have a look at flatuicolors.com for some quick and easy choices. Click on the color that you want and it will copy the appropriate color code. You may then paste it into your CSS. You could change fonts. We've set this up with Arial as our font. Feel free to change this to something else. Or you could change the padding, the margin, the borders, the spacing, rounded corners, or anything else you like. This challenge should take about 10 minutes to complete. I'll show you my solution in the next video. Have fun and enjoy.
To write code for the web, we need a code editor. CodePen is a popular online tool used for sharing code, practicing coding techniques, and inspiring other developers. It's located at codepen.io, and it offers a free account, which is perfect for your work in this course. Head on over to the site, create your account, and let's start coding.
Click on the Start Coding button in the upper left to create a pen or a blank screen where you can start coding. You'll see 3 boxes on the top of the screen, which are there to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Underneath, you'll see a larger window spanning across 3 columns. This is where your work will display. Let's start by typing in the HTML window a little bit of text. Hello, my name is Jen. Notice how that text displays immediately on the window underneath the HTML window? If you were to turn your work into a web page, that's what you'd see at this point. Let's add another sentence to this on its own line. I live in Boston. Even though I have these sentences on separate lines in the HTML box, they show as being on the same line in my display box. Why is this? Because HTML doesn't know that it should make these into separate paragraphs. Let's fix that problem quickly by placing paragraphs tags around each sentence, and that will indicate that these are in fact paragraphs. So a tag looks like this. It's an angle bracket, and in this case it's going to be followed by the letter P for paragraph. And then we need to tell it where to stop, so we're going to put in another angle bracket, a slash, and a P after that. And that will indicate that this is a paragraph. And we can do the same thing here around the next line. CodePen will display this for you, honoring the paragraph elements that you added to the text. Before we move on, let's modify the view of this window. By default, the code shows at the top of the screen and the display underneath. Using the Change View button, we can put the code on the left side and the display on the right. I find this to be easier to read, as you can adjust the size of each coding window easily while still viewing your display. So if we click this button here, let's change it to putting the code on the left-hand side. Notice that we can make these boxes bigger or smaller as needed. So since I'm just working with HTML right now, I can just pull my CSS and JavaScript here out of the way. Now let's say that we wanted to make this text a different color. In the CSS box that you see here, type P for paragraph, and then a couple of these curly brackets. Those are the ones that are next to the letter P, most likely on your keyboard. Hit the Shift key in order to get them. And in between these curly brackets, we're going to type color and the following: a pound or hashtag sign, FF0000, and then put a semicolon after all of that. Now your text should display as red text. Our style applies to all paragraph elements, so that's why both paragraphs have red text.
Congrats! You've created your first web page. To save your work, click the Save button in the top right. Now that you know how CodePen works, let's try writing some more code. A domain name is the address for your website. For example, www.linkedin.com is the address for LinkedIn. Domain names are often inexpensive, and it's easy to purchase one or several for your website to go with your web hosting. To choose a good domain name, think about something that's easy to say to someone when talking, easy to spell, not too long, and memorable, ideally. Your name might make a good domain name to start. For example, my website is at www.jenkramer.org. I also own variations on that domain name, including jenkramer.net, .com, .biz, and even jenkramer.rocks. I'm not necessarily using all of those domain names at one time. Just because you purchase a domain name does not mean you must use it. However, you will be asked to pay a fee to renew your name once a year. That price may range from $10 to hundreds of dollars per year, depending on what name you choose. Domain names may also be associated with countries. If the name ends in 2 characters, this is often a country code. For example, a domain name ending in .com.au is an Australian name. Today, there are hundreds of endings for domain names, which take us beyond the usual .com, .net, or .org endings. You can buy names that end in .education, .guide, .dev, .app, and hundreds of others. To purchase domain names, you'll need to go to a domain name registrar. Your web host may sell domain names for purchase, which is often the easiest solution for those who are just starting out. Alternatively, you may buy your name from a domain name registrar like domains.google. Once you've purchased the name, you'll need to work with your web host to point the name from the registrar to the hosting. Think of this as adding a road sign on the internet. The sign is added by making changes to the DNS, or domain name system. Your web hosting company and domain name registrar will have very explicit instructions for making these changes and connections. It often takes about 48 hours for the changes to apply. After that, when you type your domain name into your web browser, your website at your web hosting will be pulled up. Most developers own a few dozen domain names. Most of those names aren't in use. They were often a brainstorm for a new service or a business that they want to build, but they just never got around to doing it. Other people are speculators, purchasing names that they think will go up in value. In any case, the best name to purchase is often your own name, with some type of easy ending. That will eventually be the basis of your portfolio website, a blog, or other personal work. Your name is flexible enough that it could be anything, and it's also work safe. That makes it a perfect choice for purchase as your first domain. Websites are only visible to the general public if their web server is also accessible to the public. When web server software runs on web server hardware, and that system is maintained by a company who will sell you some space on it, that's referred to as a web host or hosting. While you can host your own website on your own computer, you really shouldn't. Your internet service provider may have rules prohibiting you from doing this, and you really don't want just anyone looking at the website from your own personal computer. Fortunately, web hosting is relatively inexpensive, and there are many companies offering it. If you're building a simple website with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, any web host will support you. Indeed, the simplest option may be through GitHub. Using their free GitHub Pages service at pages.github.com, you may post your website code on GitHub and view the site through their service. However, there are many other types of web hosting available. Shared hosting is web hosting where one web server has thousands of web hosting accounts located on it. You share this server with thousands of sites and their corresponding traffic. Hosting is cheap, often less than $100 per year. However, customization of the hosting account is limited, and your site may run very slowly due to the other sites on the same server sucking up all of the server's resources. More expensive options exist, which will give you better performance for your website. A virtual private server, or VPS, will have fewer accounts per server, maybe only a dozen or less. Or you could go with a dedicated server where you'll have control over the entire server for your own work. It's unlikely you need either of these options for a small portfolio website or for schoolwork, but it's good to know that they exist for your future career. Finally, you'll see many hosting companies talk about cloud hosting. Whereas standard web hosting offers you a fixed service, cloud hosting will scale with your needs in the moment. If you have a ton of traffic for one moment in time, cloud hosting will accommodate that, while standard web hosting might be overwhelmed. Pricing for cloud hosting is generally tied to usage, so the more traffic you have, the more you'll pay. In general, as you get started with your early websites, shared hosting or GitHub Pages is likely the right fit for you. Later in your career, you'll encounter many other types of hosting. GitHub is a technology that's used throughout web development. Unfortunately, there are few explanations that describe what its purpose is. Let's talk about Git, GitHub, and why these tools are so important in today's development environments. If you've ever created a Microsoft Word document, you're probably familiar with versioning. Document final, document final, document the real final, and so forth, until you think you're done, but more changes are made. Maybe you've started to attach version numbers to the document as a result. You keep the earlier versions of your document just in case you need to go back to them, or in case someone decides that they like the earlier version better. This is what Git was designed to do. Git is a software program that runs on the command line on your computer. Git will do all of the things I just described, like keeping versions of your code, enabling rollbacks to earlier versions of the code, tracking the changes made, and so forth. Git is great, but it's a bit more difficult to share coding files with others. That's where GitHub comes in. GitHub uses Git to do all of that versioning and file management work, combined with web hosting to enable easy sharing of files within a team of people. While you may use Git without GitHub, you can't use GitHub without Git. Git is deeply integrated into GitHub itself, so much so that people often forget that they are separate services. Let's take a look at a typical GitHub page using Bootstrap as an example at github.com/twbs. Here you'll see the team of contributors to the Bootstrap project. There's also a group of projects called repositories or repos. These are individual projects within the Bootstrap organization. In Bootstrap's case, there's the actual Bootstrap framework itself, as well as icons, a blog, and other projects as well. Each repo includes the files and folders that make up that piece of software. Let's look at the Bootstrap repo. Inside of this, we have access to the code under the Code tab. This is the current code under development for Bootstrap. We have a tab for Issues, where users are reporting bugs and other problems with the software. A pull request is where someone has written some code that they'd like to contribute to the project. The maintenance team will decide which pull requests should be included, if any, in the released versions of Bootstrap. The LinkedIn Learning Library offers many courses for all levels of expertise on Git and GitHub. So if you'd like to know more about this important aspect of web development, check the library for more information. If you're sold on writing code, You'll need to get an editor for writing it. CodePen is an awesome way to learn code, experiment quickly, or share code with others, but it's not a long-term development environment. At its simplest, you need a text editor to edit your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript coding files. Notepad on Windows or TextEdit on Mac are already present on your computer. However, these programs are somewhat lacking, starting with the code isn't color-coded, making it harder to read and find errors. You can write code with these programs, but should you? There are many other choices for code editors, most of which are free. In my experience, the favorite choice seems to change every 5 years or so. Let's look at a few of the most popular options. Currently, the editor that most developers seem to use is called Visual Studio Code, or VS Code. It's free, runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it comes from Microsoft. You'll see VS Code used in a number of LinkedIn Learning courses, including many of my own. Recently, VS Code was made to run directly in a web browser. You can access this version of VS Code at vscode.dev. Another favorite is Atom at atom.io from GitHub. Atom is also free and runs on Mac, Linux, and Windows. Atom is open source and highly customizable, making it a favorite with developers who enjoy customizing their workspaces. You may think that it's odd that two editors come from Microsoft. GitHub was purchased by Microsoft in 2018. However, VS Code and Atom were created in 2014, prior to the merger. Many designers are fans of Brackets at brackets.io. Brackets was formerly an editor from Adobe and runs on Mac or Windows. Adobe has released Brackets as an open source project which will be maintained by the Brackets community going forward. Finally, Sublime Text was favored by the web development community for years, but it's recently fallen out of favor. It's located at sublimetext.com and has a fee of $80 to use the editor. Many front-end developers still have Sublime installed on their machines, even if they no longer use it often. It works on Mac, PC, and Linux. These are just a handful of my favorite editors. In all likelihood, your employer will point you to a preferred editor, or you'll develop a favorite through your college, coding bootcamp, or through watching LinkedIn Learning videos.